Hey, welcome back. So deleting columns, filtering rows, and changing data types can be really useful when tidying up raw data into something manageable and meaningful. But that's often not enough. Quite commonly, we also need to apply transformations to the actual data in those columns in ways beyond something as simple as just changing a data type. One example of this is numerical transformations, like addition or multiplication. In addition to changing the values of a column in place, these kinds of transformations can also add useful new columns to our data set. Say, for example, we want to calculate the amount of money we made on each sale, assuming a 5% commission based on the sale price. So to do this, we would need to use the values in our sale price column as the basis for another calculated or derived column. Basically, we want a brand new column in which each row of data is 5% of the amount in the same row in the sale price column. Now, Power Query actually makes it incredibly easy to do something like this. Your first step, as usual, is to select the column of interest. So we'll select the sale price column by clicking the column header. Now we need to select the column because the values in this column are going to be the basis of our new derived column. Now looking up at our ribbon, we see that we have our Transform tab and our Add Column tab. And if you recall, I said the main difference between the commands on those two tabs is that the commands on the Transform tab change data in place, whereas the commands on the Add Column tab drop that transformed data into a brand new column. So you've probably guessed at this point, we're going to select our Add Column tab. And here we see that our commands are grouped into a few categories. We have General, from Text, from Number, and from Date and Time. Well, we're going to be deriving a column from a numerical value, a number, our sale price. So let's look in the From Number section. Now what we're doing doesn't involve trigonometry or scientific calculations or anything like that. I'd say it's pretty standard to multiply a number by another number, so let's click the Standard button. And here we see all the standard arithmetic operations: add, multiply, subtract, divide, etc. Now in our case, we're multiplying our sale price values by a number, so we'll choose Multiply. And now we're prompted to enter a number by which we want to multiply each value in the column that's the basis of our calculation, the sale prices. So to get 5% of those sale prices, I'll just multiply those values by 0.05 and then click OK. And now a new column has been inserted into our data set all the way on the right side called multiplication. Now this is a case where Power Query's naming skills aren't exactly the best, but in its defense, it can't read our minds and know what we might want to call this column. So it just names it after the arithmetic operation that we applied. Now obviously we won't want to stick with such a generic name, so we'll rename the column Commission. So I'll just double click the column header and type in Commission. And it would also be more logical if this column was placed directly to the right of the column it's based on, sale price. So I'm actually going to click the column header and then hold down my mouse button so I can drag it over to the left of our sale date column. And there we are, a brand new derived column that we renamed and positioned logically within our data. And if we look over at our list of applied steps, we see that we have a new step for inserted multiplication, a new step for renaming the column, and a new step for reordering the column. And while I won't waste your time by making you watch me rename these steps, in the real world the best practice would be to name all of these steps so that they're easy to distinguish from one another in case we want to edit them later. So now that we've performed a numerical calculation to add a new derived column to our data, let's try another one to transform a column of our data in place. So if you look at the values in our asking price column, you'll see that there are 2 digits after the decimal place, just as with the sale price column. But let's say our marketing folks have decided that having pennies on our asking price just isn't very meaningful and might even seem bizarre to a prospective buyer. So what we would like to do is round those pennies up or down to the nearest dollar. Now we don't need to create a brand new column to do this, we just want to transform these values in place. So instead of selecting the Add Column tab, we'll opt for our Transform tab. And again, we're applying a numerical transformation here. So we'll look at the group of commands in the number column section. And right away I see a button for rounding. So I'll just click that. And we're given the option to round up, round down, or just round. Now I want to round these values to the nearest dollar. So I don't want to necessarily round up or round down. So I'll just choose round. And now Power Query just asks us how many decimal places we want to round to. And because I don't want to see anything after the decimal place, I'll just choose 0 and then click OK. And there we are. Our asking prices are still formatted as currency, but now all of those pesky penny values have been rounded up or down to the nearest dollar. Now lastly, I want to look at adding a new column to our data that isn't based on any columns in our existing data and isn't based on a calculation. So you might be asking, how is this new column numerical in nature? Well, what I want to add is what's known as an index column. Now, an index column has a number that uniquely identifies each row in our data set. Now, depending on your background with databases or structured data, that may or may not make a lot of sense to you right now. But take my word for it that when it comes to the kind of data you'll deal with in the realm of analytics and especially business intelligence, having a field with values that uniquely identify every row in a data set is crucial. And the typical convention for these types of columns is that their values are a sequence of numbers, typically from 1 to the number of rows in the data set. And Power Query actually makes it super easy to add a column like this to our data. So since we're adding a column, we'll naturally click our Add Column tab. And right away, almost directly under the Add Column tab, I see a button for Index Column. So I'll click that. And by default, Power Query generated a sequence of numbers starting from 0 all the way to 1 less than the number of rows in our data set, which is almost what we wanted, but not quite. We actually want our sequence to begin with the number 1. So we could delete this column and then add a new index starting with the number 1, but if you watched the last video, you probably know at this point that there's a better way, and that's to edit the step in place. So with our added index step selected in our list of applied steps, we'll click the little gear icon, and now we're presented with a dialog box that lets us specify the starting index. Now Power Query chose 0 for us by default, but we'll change that to 1. And then the default increment, which is the number by which each value in the index column increases from row to row, is 1. And that makes sense 99.9% of the time for index columns, so we'll leave that as is. So now I'll click OK. And now with just a few clicks, we've generated a sequential index column for our data set. And now the last step will be to just move this column in front of all the other columns, which is pretty conventional when it comes to index type columns. So I'll click it and then just drag until I'm all the way at the beginning of our data set. And then I'll let go of my mouse button, and it looks like we're good to go. All right, so now that we've seen how to apply transformations to numerical data, let's turn our attention to perhaps the most common variety of data of all, text data, like the names of people or things. That's up next. I'll see you then.